Okay, welcome back to our CST 100 course. Now we're going to try to cover the book of 1st and 2nd Samuel and the book of 1st and 2nd Kings. We'll see what we could do. Um, these books are covering the time period from about 1070 all the way down to 586 BC. So about 500 plus years of history covered in these books, 1st and 2nd Samuel and 1st and 2nd Kings. Really, these are almost like sequels. So part 1, part 2, part 3, part 4. 1st Samuel being the part 1, 2nd Samuel part 2, 1st Kings being part 3, and 2nd Kings being part 4. So let's go ahead and take a look at these histories. So in the book of 1 Samuel, we see it begins with Samuel as a judge. So there is a little bit of overlap between the time of Judges in the book of Judges and 1 Samuel. We see it starting with Samuel as a judge. We see then this narrative between Samuel and Saul, namely Samuel anointing Saul to be king and then Saul reigning as king. And then this back and forth between Saul, the anointed king, um, um, who is currently reigning, and David, who actually is also anointed to be king, and this back and forth. And then First Samuel ends, Second Samuel ends with David's reign as king over God's people. So major themes is this movement really from a confederacy, or we could say tribal states, to a monarchy, and then really to an empire. We're seeing God's choice of king, which is moving the storyline of Scripture forward. Up until this point, we've seen God give instructions about a king, namely in Genesis 49, he's going to come from the tribe of Judah. And then in the book of Numbers, we see that he is going to save God's people from his enemies. And it's not until 2 Samuel chapter 7 that we learn that the king of God's people is going to be a child of David. So if we're thinking in the storyline, we see God's plan for creation. It's to establish his kingdom and his son, which is ultimately Jesus, as king over creation. And then we're seeing that kingdom is going to be through Abraham and his offspring, which is the nation of Israel. And we're seeing how this nation is going to look different than the other nations. They're going to be loyal to God and treating one another in truly human ways. But if this nation is going to exemplify that, if they're going to embody God's kingdom, they need to have a king, according to the book of Judges. But not just any king, and certainly not a king like all the other nations. They need a king who will shepherd them to God, who will execute righteousness and justice, and who will love God's people and love God most of all. And we're seeing in the book of 1 Samuel that kind of king is not Saul. It is David. In other words, the prototype or the mold for the ultimate king of God's people is not Saul. It's David. So let's look at this now in 1 Samuel. So 1 Samuel, as we've already said, it begins with the time of Judges. Eli is the high priest, and he is worthless because he is not disciplining his children. It's such an important idea. His children are really not acting like leaders in God's kingdom. They are offering unlawful sacrifices. They are, I would not say committing adultery. They are probably raping and all kinds of sexual immorality with the women serving in the temple. Basically, God's temple looks like a cult prostitute temple. In other words, it's functioning just like the temple of Baal and the other temples in the ancient world, which is indicating that God's kingdom is looking just like the kingdoms of this world. And in the book of Samuel, Eli knows about this, and he doesn't do anything about it. And it's really, really tragic. Maybe there is some cowardice, but we also learn that he is benefiting from this. So there were certain parts of the sacrifices that were supposed to be sacrificed completely to God, and these Hophni and Phinehas are taking those sacrifices and giving it to their dad to eat. So we're seeing just this tragedy starting out in the book of First Samuel. Namely, it's just like the time of Judges. But we see Samuel being born. It's again amazing, guys. I mean, the hero of the beginning of First Samuel is this woman named Hannah, who is an Israelite woman, but she's barren. And let's take that serious. Barrenness today is a tragedy. When a woman is unable to get pregnant, it's an absolute tragedy. But in the context of ancient Israel, there were other layers to the tragedy. And what I mean by that is, again, there was no Social Security in the ancient Near East. So the way you provided for yourself when you were old is by having children who would take care of you. So Hannah has no guarantee that when she's older, she'll have anybody to take care of her. And if she's unable to have children, then there's going to be nobody, theoretically, to take care of her husband. This is an economic problem. This is also a social problem, where the inability to have children was shameful in this society. And so it's a societal problem for Hannah, but it's also just a mother problem. I mean, I don't know how many of you are moms or how many of you are who are fathers who have wives who have children, but it's glorious to have children. I mean, let's think about this for a moment. In a society like America, where we have denigrated children and child rearing, and you can see my two children. I love my children to pieces on the wall. Women, when you have a child, when you're able to get pregnant and have a child, you are participating with God in making His image. Isn't that amazing? Like, you are making the image of God with your body. And that is glorious. It's amazing. It's missional, because that is a part of the mission, to be fruitful and multiply. It's glorious and it's good. So Hannah isn't just experiencing economic problems and social problems. Something in her very identity is being frustrated in her barrenness. And what does Hannah do? She doesn't turn to worldly practices like Sarah did with Abraham. She turns to prayer, and she prays. And she goes to the temple, and Eli sees her and thinks she's drunk. And she's like, no, I'm just sad. And Eli says, you're going to have a son. And sure enough, she does. But Hannah made a promise that if God would give her a son, she would dedicate him to the Lord. Namely, he would live at the temple and he would serve God. So she would give up economic stability in her future. And she did it. When Samuel was, after he was nursed and old enough, he went to the temple. And that's Samuel, the final judge of God's people, who is a contrast to Hophni and Phinehas in their barbaric nature and failure to treat one another in truly human ways and failure to love God with loyalty. We see Samuel as a different example. And he came from Hannah, a barren Israelite woman who in her pain turned to God and not to this world. We're seeing early on the ark is captured by the Philistines, where the Philistines take the Ark of the Covenant and they put it in the temple of Dagon. Now, Dagon was like the fish god, because the Philistines were sailors, so they worshipped a fish god. And this was significant because when you put the ark in let's say what the ark is. The ark is the holiest place where the 10 Commandments were kept, and certain things like Moses' staff that budded, and it signified God's presence to God's people. This is what got when the priests went into the holiest of holies, the ark was there in God's presence. You had cherubim who were covering the ark of the covenant, angels with big wings. Remember, the cherubim also guarded the way to the Garden of Eden, and now they're guarding the Ark of the Covenant. This was stolen after God's people got defeated in battle by the Philistines. Why? Because the Israelites thought of it like a religious trinket, like they were being defeated by the Philistines. So what do they think? Well, let's get the Ark of the Covenant out here. And then God will defeat our enemies. Like, let's just think about that for a moment. That's how pagans think. That, like, if you have a religious symbol or, this religious token, like, God is magically in this place and he'll magically fight for you. And that's not Israelite religion. That is not Christianity. Christianity is not about having a token. It's not about manipulating God. Like, if you just move God out of a tent into a battle, then he'll fight for you. That's not what it's like at all. Christianity is about a relationship with God where you can't manipulate him. And here we have Eli, Hophni, and Phinehas trying to manipulate God, and God lets them get defeated in battle, and the ark gets stolen. Now the Philistines think that means their God, the fish god, is better than the Lord. So they stick the ark in the temple to Dagon. But crazy, like, the next morning they come in and the statue of Dagon is fallen down and it's prostrated before the Ark of the Covenant. The next day they come in and its hands have been cut off and its feet have been cut off, symbolized that the Lord has victory over Dagon. And the Philistines are so afraid, they give the Ark back. It's crazy. But what we're seeing is that in Samuel, like, God's people are getting defeated in battle. And the people think it's because they don't have a king. They're thinking they're getting defeated in battle because they don't have somebody to fight their battles. And that is really significant. So they're saying right here, so you could pause me, I'm not going to read these verses, but pause me and read these verses. But what you see is that the people, they think that they are being defeated in battle because they don't have a king to go before them and fight their battles. And let's just ask the question, did they have somebody to fight their battles? And the answer is yes. God was there to fight their battles. The problem had nothing to do with God. Had nothing to do with their inability to have somebody fight their battles. It had everything to do with the people's hearts. It had everything to do. God's people were getting defeated in battle, not because they didn't have a powerful protector, but because they were wicked sinners. And they weren't being faithful to God. And they weren't treating one another with loyal love. So because of that reality, they kept getting defeated, but they were confused. So they said, give us a king who will fight our battles. Listen, friends, they would rather walk by sight than by faith. Because it's a lot easier to be confident when you have a bunch of tanks and a bunch of bazookas and nuclear bombs, or in this context, you have a king who's really big, and you have a centralized government with a big army. Then you can walk by sight. That nobody's going to conquer you because you have a lot of weapons. But God wanted his people to walk by faith. God wanted his people to trust in his goodness. God wanted his people to trust in God. And they couldn't see God. God wanted his people to be loyal to him. But they were disloyal because of their sin. So God gave them Saul. And when we look at Saul, we see complete tragedy. It starts off really, really strong, really, really good, but soon we see that this choice by worldly standards leads to a worldly king. And if you were to summarize these sins, the unlawful sacrifice, the rash vow, the refusal to fully destroy the Amalekites, you see that God gave his people a king who was just like them, a king who would not walk by faith, but a king who would walk by sight, a king who in his own time, he would make sacrifices that he shouldn't have made. He would make a vow that was dangerous, and he would refuse to wipe out arch enemies of God's people. Why? Because he would not trust God. And that is not the kind of king God's people need. And let's think about that for a moment. We don't need a king who walks by sight. We need a king who walks by faith. So God gives them David. And David is a man who walks by faith. He's not a perfect man, but he doesn't look like a king. When Samuel anoints him, he's like, that's not the king. He's a shepherd, shepherder. He is not very tall. He's kind of scraggly looking. The Bible says he's handsome, but he does not look like a king. When he goes and fights Goliath, like Saul puts the armor on him, and he does not look like a king at all. And this is who God's people need. Samuel anoints him. Notice he's not anointed because of appearances, but he's anointed rather because of his heart. The Lord looks at the heart. And then after David's anointed, we're seeing this back and forth between Saul and David, where Saul is trying to kill David, and ultimately leads to Saul dying in battle, and David now being anointed as king over God's people. So when we get to 2 Samuel 7, let's take a break and let's just say this. God has given his people the land he promised them. He's given them descendants, like he said. They are now a kingdom with a law about how to be loyal to God and how to treat one another in truly human ways. And now they have a king who walks by faith and not by sight. This looks like the pinnacle of God's plan, right? I mean, in reality, this is God's plan. Like when you look at David and his kingdom, and it is a picture of what God is planning on doing, but it is just a picture. So in 2 Samuel 7, we get God's covenant with David. And let's remind ourselves, a covenant is an agreement between parties based on love and loyalty. And God makes a covenant with David. And the covenant is that God would give David an eternal dynasty. Namely, one of his sons will be the king of God's people forever. That is the plan. That is the covenant that he gives him. But right after this covenant, we see tragedy happen. We see David taking Bathsheba, laying with her, committing sexual immorality against her, and then killing Uriah in battle. We see these complete tragedies, which is a complete failure to treat Bathsheba and Uriah in truly human ways. He treats both of them as objects. And this is something the kings of the world did, not the kings of God's people. We then see Nathan come and confront the king, and he tells them this parable about sheep. Now remember, David's a shepherd. He's a shepherd. And the parable is there's this rich man who has a lot of sheep, and then there's this poor man with one sheep. The poor man treats the one sheep like one of his daughters. He eats at the table with him and sleeps in the house. And the rich man had a visitor, and he didn't take one of his own sheep to feed the visitor. He took the one sheep, and he killed it and fed it to his visitor. And Nathan said, "What should be done to this man?" And David said, "He must die." And Nathan said, "You are the man." And what David did is he pronounced a death sentence upon himself. And Nathan said, "You will not die. God will put your sin away." Now let's think about that for a moment. How can God just put David's sin away? He just murdered somebody and committed a heinous sexual act against Bathsheba. And he's just going to put the sin away. Well, that all points forward again to Jesus, friends, where God is putting sin away, even heinous sin, that he's dealing with at the cross. That sin of murdering Uriah and Bathsheba will be dealt with, and it's going to be dealt with at the cross. But there are consequences. Nathan says, like, the sword will not depart your family. David had a few sons one son, Absalom, who rebelled against David, tried to kill him. We have another son who raped his sister, his half-sister. Like, you see David's family just being affected by this sin in terrible ways. And let that be a lesson to all of us, that sins are often inherited. It doesn't take a rocket scientist to realize this. If you just look at statistics about domestic violence or sexual abuse or divorce or drug abuse, these things are often inherited. Because let's not be naive. Sin always affects children. it always affects those who are innocent around us. So be warned, friends, like in your families, like the sins that you are engaging and being okay with will be passed down to your children. And that's what happens to David. So we saw this incredible high in the book of Samuel, and yet it comes crumbling down, which tells us that what we're seeing in 2 Samuel is merely a picture of what's to come. Okay, we did not get into Kings. Let's take a break, and we'll do Kings in the next lecture.